one of the common themes that ran through across all the panels was infrastructure, right? The permitting issues, for example, and what we are trying to show here are challenges with getting a CCUS project off the ground, right? Depending on where you are, a capture project could take as much as 5 to 8 years, right? All the way to commissioning, for example. A transport project could also take 5 to 8 years, right? Depending on where you are. And even a storage project is taking the same amount of time, right? And so there's quite a bit of work and time that is required to kind of commission a lot of these projects and get all of this built. So getting this infrastructure built is not straightforward. We talked a little bit about Class 6 permitting wells in the morning. It's a pretty long process, and obviously some of it could be solved by delegating that into the states. This is the whole primacy issue that we were talking about earlier today. But it's still a fairly long process. Chuck was talking about this in the morning, but if you see that big tranche on the right? So there's a typo here, by the way. It's Class 6, not Class 4 wells, but those Class 6 wells, there are about 110 that are awaiting technical review, right? So there's quite a bit of these wells that need to get permitted here. And if you look at utilities, and Jason will probably talk about this, but there's pretty much so much capacity that is waiting for interconnection that it's pretty much as much is as big as the amount of capacity that's operating today. So essentially, we'll double the generation capacity that's out there for renewables if we got everything that's waiting and interconnection permitted, right? So there's quite a bit of stuff there. We talked a little bit about mobility and the hydrogen in mobility applications. There's a lot of infrastructure that needs to be built if this happens. We see a lot of companies active in the space, but when you actually count specific hydrogen refueling stations that these companies are committing to build, it's actually a very small number today, right? So there's quite a bit of infrastructure that needs to be built. And so let's talk to Jason and Prasenjeet and see what they have to say about some of the challenges with all of this stuff here. So before we get started here, Prasenjeet, help us understand what you do at ExxonMobil. This venture executive, I've been getting a lot of questions around that. So help us understand what does a venture executive do? We all understand what a senior vice president of government affairs does, but a venture executive is something that we all need some help understanding.
Well, I'm trying to figure out that myself. But first of all, I think thank you for all of you to be here. We are panel number 6. That's the last panel of the day. So what Jason and I have the predicament is the same as what Henry VIII's 6th wife had. The people are tired, they're exhausted, but we still have to spice it up. We have to make it interesting for you guys. Let's start with the very first question. What does a venture executive do? So by background, I have a PhD in chemical engineering with a MBA as well. And my job is to find new ways to make hydrogen, new cleaner ways to make hydrogen better than what's available in the market, and then scale it up as a business. So the role was defined a year ago, and I work in low carbon solutions where Lydia works as well. And our objective is that the 4 pillars that ExxonMobil is working on, CCS, hydrogen, biofuels, and lithium, how do we scale these concepts from a lab or pilot scale to a real business? I focus on the hydrogen value chain. We have a big play in Baytown as blue hydrogen, the world's biggest blue hydrogen. So we want to make that commercially attractive. As part of the hydrogen venture, we also are looking at other ways to make hydrogen at large scale and make it commercially attractive. So that's where I'm focusing most of my time on. I'll pass it on to Jason.
Yeah, Jason, so tell us a little bit about, I think there's good understanding of what you do, but what are some of the things that you're focused on today?
Sure, so I work at CenterPoint Energy, and for those of you in Houston, you may know that we're the local gas and electric utility. Fortune 500 company based here. I grew up on the legal side of our business and served as general counsel of the company before being asked to take on the responsibility to lead our regulatory services and government affairs group. It's about 150 colleagues throughout the mid-continent that deal with our state regulators for our gas and utility operations. And then obviously it's a very heavily regulated business that we're in, and so we are quite active trying to make sure that the laws evolve with what our customers want to see us doing. So that's the government affairs side of things, where we advocate for policy changes alongside our customers in the various states where we operate. I'll talk a lot about our electric utility here in the greater Houston area. Here we serve almost 3 million homes and businesses with transmission and distribution utility service. We don't own generation in Texas and haven't for about 25 years. We also, our natural gas utility business is the largest natural gas utility in the country in terms of miles of pipe in the ground. We operate enough pipe to, if you set it out end to end, you could stretch it all the way around the earth and all the way around the earth and all the way around the earth almost 5 times. So quite a large business there as well.
So, when you think of energy transition, when you think of a city like Houston, right, what does that mean for CenterPoint, right? How is CenterPoint thinking about energy transition and transmission and distribution for, what is it, the 4th largest city in the U.S.?
Yeah, soon to be 3rd, right? With the largest medical center on the planet, one of the largest petrochemical complexes in the world, home to 26 Fortune 500 companies, and lots of other stuff, right? So we are a little bit less than 3% of the area of Texas in the utility area that we serve here in the greater Houston area. But about 25% of the usage of the state. So what that means is we import most of the power to serve Houstonians every day. As electrification occurs, particularly in the industrial sector, that means more infrastructure is going to need to be built. There's not enough power in Houston to power Houston, right? There's not enough local generation. Which means as we consume more power in Houston, more infrastructure needs to be built to bring electrons to the Houston area. The Greater Houston Partnership, for those of you unfamiliar with it, it's basically our local chamber of commerce. Greater Houston Partnership is on the verge of issuing a study where they've been looking at electric usage changes primarily driven by industrial electrification, and that study will show in a relatively moderate case, so not even the most extreme case of electrification, but relatively moderate likely case, electric usage in Houston will triple by 2050, and it's fairly front-end loaded. So to give you some idea of what that means, if we're 25% of the state's usage now and we triple, and Houston is not the only place where there's industrial electrification going on in the state, you can imagine what that means from an infrastructure perspective with respect to the entire state's electric grid. And what it means is that you have to have an all-of-the-above solution to meet Texans' energy needs, right? We need more generation, we need more transmission, we need more energy efficiency. Virtual power plants that are using the distribution system to actually put power back on to the grid. Increasingly, we need to do more of that. So there's no silver bullet in life generally, and there's no silver bullet to meeting Texans' energy needs, and so you need all of the above solution for it.
So, Prasenjeet, the same question for you, right? When, as an oil and gas major, right, how does Exxon think about the infrastructure, and particularly as it relates to energy transition, right? I mean, just as an example, right? Not everybody, but a lot of large process industries are trying to electrify operations, processes where they can electrify those operations, right? So if that happens, then obviously there's a big spike in industrial electric demand, right? So for a scenario like that, are companies, large companies like Exxon, going to predominantly build out some of that infrastructure themselves, or would they rely and partner with players like CenterPoint? Right? How do you think about that infrastructure need?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think if you take a step back, what are we trying to do in Exxon? For the last 100 years, we have been in the energy providing business. So we look at this whole issue as an and equation, that we will still be in the energy providing business, but the narrative that has changed is climate change is real. So can we provide energy to the world still in the same way, but at the same time have a cleaner source of energy? So that's the and equation of providing the energy and doing it in a clean and responsible way. For us, energy transition is all about scale. So how do we scale these things up? That's why we created this business called Low Carbon Solutions 2 years ago, with a clear commitment that we will bring technologies that will work at scale. We have a $17 billion capital commitment that we'll intend to invest here for the next 5 to 6 years. That is by far one of the largest commitments in the energy transition space to make the whole thing work. Now back to the question of electrification. Now I agree with Jason that it's called transition for a reason, because nobody knows exactly which solution will win in the end. So we are technology agnostic in that sense, but what we do believe in are certain principles. Principle is, well, whatever solution you provide, it has to be affordable, it has to have low carbon intensity, it needs to be reliable, and so on. So take the case of industrial decarbonization. Certainly electrification is a way to go. It will help in electrifying number of process units and so on. But we also see that there are areas or pockets where maybe hydrogen is a better solution than electrification. So as a company, we have made a conscious choice that in the whole energy transition space, we will bet in certain verticals where we bring some differentiated advantage. And those verticals are hydrogen, those verticals are CCS, those verticals are biofuels, and now most recently lithium. Because we think that there, ExxonMobil as a company can bring something different than what the rest of the world has. On the electrification side, which is the electron side of the value chain, we are going to be a big user of it, but not the generators, not the developers, because we don't think as a company that's our core strength. So we'll rely on partners like CenterPoint Energy and other source providers to help us build the value chain. But in the end, we stay true to our principles that if the world has to decarbonize, it needs to happen at scale, and it has to follow certain principles, which is low carbon intensity, reliability, affordability, and so on.
So, Prasenjeet, that makes sense, but like if you take a look at Dow, for example, right? I mean, as analysts, we are looking at a lot of companies and what they are doing, right? So what Dow is saying is, we're going to electrify the steam crackers, right? And to produce olefins and all of that, right? And I think the approach that you are taking is we're going to use blue hydrogen coming out of this project that you're doing in Baytown and use that to run your steam crackers, right? To decarbonize olefin production. But what Dow is saying is that, let's say we try to electrify the steam cracker to make olefins, and let's say that we have to do it with renewable power. That's going to increase the renewable power demand by an order of magnitude for that particular site. And they think that at that point of time, and this is all stuff that they put out in the public domain, right? So, and at that point of time, if there's an order of magnitude increase in electric demand, and that has to come from renewable power, you're no longer going to get renewable power at 7-8 cents a kilowatt hour that industrial sites are used to here on the US Gulf Coast. It's going to be more like 70-80 cents a kilowatt hour. So therefore, they are saying we're going to invest in, let's say, small-scale nuclear, small modular nuclear reactors for that site, right? So that's the underlying thinking there, right? So at some point of time, right, as Exxon and its sites start using more electricity, right? I think the question will start flipping over and saying like, okay, should we be taking on a more active role in terms of electricity generation? I don't know if you want to comment on that.
So it's a fair question, and I'll take a step back and say, how do we think about any opportunity in the first place? So there are two dimensions we look at, and I'll come back to the specific question you're asking about, should we be in the electricity generation business or not? The first dimension is the size of the market big enough that it's an attractive opportunity? I think on the electricity side, you will say yes, the size of the opportunity is big enough that it will interest Exxon's scale and desire. The second dimension is, do we bring any differentiating advantage to the whole value chain? Mm-hmm. If the answer is yes, then obviously we'll be part of that value chain. So in this particular case, when we have looked at electricity or renewable power, we have looked at it over and over again, and I think we have concluded that where we sit today, it makes more sense for us to be on the molecule side of the business and leverage strategic partners to get the electron side of the value chain. Mm-hmm. That narrative hasn't changed yet. Mm-hmm. Now, going back to the e-cracker or the electrifying the cracker, we are working on a number of technologies to electrify various parts of the manufacturing asset, including the cracker, which needs to be at 800 to 900 degrees centigrade. So we are looking at all of those things, but they are still, in my mind, at a technology development phase, mm-hmm. not ready for a world-scale cracker deployment.
To use it. So let me flip that question, Jason, right? I mean, you already talked about industrial demand for electricity rising, right? Does this logic make sense to you that as industrial sites, and I mean, Houston, US Gulf Coast is a massive industrial site here, right? I mean, as a region, right? So, but and a lot of these industries are under a lot of pressure to decarbonize, right? So as they start decarbonizing, they start thinking about electrifying their operations. Demand is going to rise, and you talked about that. Mm-hmm. But if that demand now has to come increasingly from renewable power, mm-hmm. how does that change what a company like CenterPoint does or thinks about transmission and distribution?
Yeah, so I think you're likely to see a mix of what companies decide to do, right? Some will have on-site generation that has existed for many, many, many decades, right? So you will have some companies that have a mix of that and maybe rely on the grid. You will have some that go completely on-site generation. You'll have some that don't do on-site generation at all. The biggest challenge from a planning perspective, though, understanding that people will choose what makes sense for their business, is that our infrastructure has to be there at a minimum as a backup for those that have on-site generation when there's a problem with that on-site generation, which means I have to build infrastructure to be a backup at any time for any length of time for those customers that choose the on-site generation path. So it really doesn't impact what I have to do as much as you might think, just because somebody has some on-site generation. Now that may change over time as on-site generation becomes more and more reliable, right? But the value of losing that on-site generation is such that I do have to be there as a backup. You know, we have a fair amount of renewable energy projects in the interconnection queue right now. Mm-hmm. If they all came online, which they won't, it would more than double the amount of generation in the Houston area. I think you will continue to see solar projects, battery storage increasingly, interconnecting with the grid. So I can't speak to exactly what power prices will do. If I did, I wouldn't be sitting here. But I do think you also have to take into account what non-renewable prices of power are going to do, as well. As you export more LNG, that's obviously going to have an impact on gas prices. Gas prices largely set electric prices, at least in the ERCOT region. So to be determined on exactly what power prices do going forward. What we've been trying to do, since we don't generate the power, is we've been trying to make sure that we keep our infrastructure affordable. If you look at, so we spend almost $2.5 billion a year on new infrastructure in the greater Houston area. And that's been true for a long time. But it's easier for me to think about it in residential rate perspective, which I know is not totally applicable to business. But we've been making sure we take costs out of our business to allow that extra $2.5 billion every year to remain affordable. So the average customer bill on the residential side, our portion of the bill 10 years ago was $49.50 on average per month. You have to layer the cost of generation on top of that, right? But our portion was $49.50. You fast forward to at least year end last year, our portion of the average residential bill was $49.50. So zero increase over that period of time, even though we're adding significant capital investment. It's because if you can take $1 out of the utility business, you can invest about $8 in capital projects and keep bills flat. Because I have to collect that $1 of expense every year. I collect my capital investment over a period of time, right? So we remain focused on keeping our part of the utility bill affordable, so that even if generation costs increase, it's not on an ever increasing infrastructure bill too, right?
Yeah, there may be just add 2 points to what Jason said. From our vantage point, even though we may not be in the generation business of power, we are one of the biggest users largest consumer of renewable power. So certainly the electron value chain is critical for us, but we just will participate in a different way.
Yeah.
The second point I want to make here is that I think a lot of the narrative focuses on renewable power. But I think the narrative should be focused on low CI power. As if the carbon footprint of the power is low, I think one should be indifferent to that, and that could be a dimension that we could think about. But back to our thinking, the framework that we use to get into any value chain or not has to meet 2 criteria: A, size is big; B, we have some differentiating capability that we can bring to the game.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. Jason, I just want to expand on some of the things that we were talking about. Number one is, if more and more companies move towards this model of on-site generation, whether it, through, let's say, low CI power, right? What does that do to CenterPoint's business model? You're a predominant transmission distribution company, so the reliance on transmission conceptually falls. And let's say as more of this on-site generation becomes more and more reliable, so you have less work to do in terms of bailing them out when their reliability is low and all of that stuff. So I'm just trying to think about, like, what does the utility of the future look like? Where does it focus its energy on?
Yeah, so I think in the short term, it probably doesn't have much impact, right? Because my costs are largely fixed, right? It doesn't cost any more to have that pole and wire if you use it 24/7, max AC, versus you turn everything off, right? The costs are the same regardless. So if somebody needs me to have the infrastructure there as a backup to their own on-site generation, right? Those costs are largely fixed. It doesn't matter if they actually use it or use it 365 days out of the year as the backup in the short term. In the long term, I won't say that we're indifferent to how our customers need to use the grid, but we will adapt to how our customers need to use the grid, right? And in fact, it's consistent with that all of the above approach is needed. Mm-hmm. We probably need some customers to have on-site generation to make sure that we are being using our resources in the best possible way to serve customers. And it's not unlike what some of us are doing at our home. With solar panels and power walls and increasingly electric vehicles that are going to be able to help us power through emergencies, right? We all are looking at our own on-site generation if you have a natural gas backup for your home, right? So you're starting to see more and more of that. I think what the future really holds is that our job used to be, and still is largely, but it's starting to change. We throw extension cords to people, right, and let them connect to the grid. That extension cord is increasingly becoming two-way. Yeah, that makes sense, right? where they're not just taking power from the grid and consuming it, but increasingly putting power back out onto the grid. And so you might have on-site generation that you might want to be hooked up to the grid and use it to go the other way when market signals dictate that that's the best thing for you to do with your resource. Just like at our homes and smaller businesses, we increasingly are seeing customers want to use their assets that they invested in. I didn't have to invest in it. They invested in it, and they want to participate in the market when the market sends them those price signals. So again, that means you have to have the infrastructure there, whether it's sending power to them or taking that power from them, that infrastructure has to be there. So I think even in the long term, I think it doesn't change a whole lot, even though there are more unknowns exactly how customers are going to want to use the grid the further out you go.
Prasenjeet, another element of infrastructure is existing infrastructure, right? And in some ways, and I think this was the point I was trying to make in the morning after the keynote that Lydia delivered, right? Like, it seems to us from outside that ExxonMobil has some sort of a brownfield strategy, right? There's nothing wrong with that. It's like you have high quality assets on the Gulf Coast. These assets have the right scale. You can go do interesting projects there. There's an existing installed customer base. And that's the approach where you're leveraging these assets, right? There's existing infrastructure that's there. I guess what role does existing infrastructure play, and until how elastic is that? How much for how much longer do you think you can keep leveraging that to address some of these energy transition issues?
So that's a tough one, but I don't think the characterization that we are just leveraging brownfield infrastructure is our strategy. I think including the infrastructure comment is an important one in energy transition, because when we talk about different technologies, people talk about LCOH, people talk about CI and so on. But what's missing in the equation is, well, does the infrastructure exist or not for you to be able to scale that concept up? So so we look at that very, very carefully, so that when we do the project investment economics, that is built into that thinking. So take, for example, CCS. If you want to do CCS at scale, you need CO2 pipelines as well. Now, we didn't have the CO2 pipelines before. We could have built one or we could acquire one. So we acquired Denbury as a company, so we got a pretty extensive network of CO2 pipelines. So it's not restricting ourselves to what we had, but rather we expanded upon it.
But it's still
right. I'm going to come to that
using other brownfields, right? It
Correct.
Not
so now take the example of hydrogen, for example. Now, if we want to scale the hydrogen business, we will also need hydrogen pipelines over a long distance to work. That's a decision that we are constantly struggling with or thinking about. What's the right way to enter this whole value chain? It's not a clear-cut black and white answer that, well, let's go ahead and build it. Because at the end of the day, you have to get return on investment as well. So when you look at the project economics over a 20-year period or whatever your time horizon is, the whole return has to make sense. And in many cases, we will probably choose that as a path where we build something. In other cases, we will leverage the existing infrastructure. Leveraging the existing infrastructure is obviously the easier way because it's faster, it's more economical and so on, but you can only do it to a certain point.
No, again, I think all of us have this connotation around brownfield, which might but I still see that as a brilliant strategy, right? I mean, these are high quality assets, and you want to squeeze as much return as you can get out of this capital that's already been deployed there. Let's switch a little bit to policy, Jason, and you're probably the best person to talk about that. I was asking this question of Brandon Schwartner in the morning at Priority Power. There is this policy concept that if you move load closer to power generation sites, they'll have lower reliance on transmission and distribution infrastructure, and therefore they should get power at cheaper prices, right? The current policy doesn't allow for that. Do you see discussion around that specific notion in and around policy circles? A concept like that, again, how would that impact an electric utility, if not necessarily CenterPoint by itself? But like, what does that do to the broader electric utility industry?
Yeah, I really don't hear a lot of discussion around that concept. Today, at least in Texas, the construct of collecting costs from the grid does not take into account distance,
location,
right?
Yeah.
It's on a postage stamp basis, right? Everybody's pays the same regardless of how far it goes. And I don't know that has a huge group of people against it. It's just not the way it's been done, right? Now, in the greater Houston area, depending on what kind of generation it is, it may be harder to get permits to build generation near where the people are. And then sometimes also you have to take into account just the natural resources that we have in the state and where it's best, right? So unfortunately, the best wind locations in the state are not where the people are.
Yeah. So
right,
just to clarify, right? So I think what such a policy would do is it won't, people are going to live where they're going to live, right? And Joe Quoizer, I don't know if he's here, but he made this point very a lot better, a lot more elegantly than I am, but earlier in the morning. But people are not going to move; they're going to live where they're going to live. But conceptually, a Bitcoin mining shop could move to closer to the generation source. In fact, that's what's happening, right? A lot of gas is being flared, and one of the primary flare gas monetization strategy is to mine Bitcoin.
That's right.
But that, because of the lack of that location-based pricing policy, we don't quite see. But there are load centers that you can conceptually move around based on that.
That's right. There are other locational price signals that exist. It's just not with respect to the transmission system, right? But there's a layer of that locational pricing, whether it's congestion related in terms of how power moves across the grid. But there's some aspect of locational pricing, and then there's some aspect of paying for the infrastructure that is not that. And so yeah, there's just not a lot of discussion around that. We'd be happy to be part of that discussion. We would love it if there was more generation that was being built near where our people are, that we have the privilege to serve.
Yeah.
We just don't see that outside of solar and batteries right now at any kind of scale. And the reason why I say we would like to see it, even though it takes an investment opportunity away from us, is because it's better if the power is near the people. It's better if you have a catastrophic outage at a large power plant in Houston, not some momentary thing, not for several days, but a catastrophic outage. You may not have the infrastructure needed for a number of years before you can add additional transmission capacity. So there's a big benefit of having power near the load, in addition to potential price benefit. There's a significant resiliency benefit of that too.
I'm going to open this panel up to questions from the audience, because I'm sure there'll be lots of questions.
Hi, very interesting panel. So my question is towards Prasenjeet. So you spoke about low CI power generations. Like in that, how do you kind of differentiate between, that would be generated due to molecule level research, contributed by infrastructure level research and then others like process innovations and digital. So how do you see the percentage of contribution for each of these sectors, I would say? And with respect to also short-term and long-term, how do you see all these are playing role in building, enabling low CI power to us?
Yeah, good question. I mean, my point behind that comment was that at the end of the day, we need to go back to the fundamentals, like what matters. In any value chain and energy transition, what matters is the full life cycle analysis, and then what is the carbon intensity of the final product that you're offering in the market, be it hydrogen, be it biofuels, be it power, and so on. The idea behind low CI power was that it's an area where we have some advantage in terms of our technical capabilities. We are in the LNG value chain. We know how LNG works. We can make technological improvements to decarbonize the LNG value chain. So your starting material can be improved to begin with. You can convert that into power. We have ideas to improve the whole power generation scheme. And then we have CCS at the back end, which is also a value chain that we are now interested in. So if you put the pieces together, you could go with that as an offering. My point was that renewable power is one way of getting low CI power, and certainly a very important and critical way of doing that, but there are other ways to do that as well. And when we talk about energy transition, we should talk about all these solutions, because right now, as back to Jason's point, there's no one silver bullet that hits the answer. We have a gamut of options, and having that optionality open is probably a good way to think about it.
More questions?
So my question goes to Jason. In the beginning of the conversation, you mentioned a couple percentages of how much energy Houston is consuming nowadays. What is the shortest, more viable solution for this energy storage that we're having? Because in the panel this morning, Brendan said that in the Memorial Day, we're this close of reaching the max point. So I wonder, what is the solution? What is your opinion on that?
Yeah, so I do think that you need more generation, right? Because even with what we have, we do reach these times of day where it's very close on whether or not there's enough. And a lot of that generation that is more of the base load generation, the gas, the coal plants, are plants that we built many, many decades ago that are older than I am, right? And they are machines and they will not last forever. And so we need more. Even if we kept everything we have, we need more. We know we're not going to keep everything we have, so we need to constantly have a market that's incenting a mix of generation, not just one technology, but we need a mix of generation to have reliable power. The interesting thing is that the challenging times on the grid are no longer 3 o'clock in the afternoon on the hottest day in summer, right? It's when the sun goes down on that hot day in the summer, and so solar drops off, and there may not be enough traditional thermal generation, and the wind's not blowing yet enough, and so you've got these hours in the late evening where it's challenging. And then the opposite problem in the wintertime, right? Before the sun comes up, when we're all waking up, turning the heat on, there's still a lot of electric heat on the grid. You're just waiting for that first bit of solar power to come online. And so we need more generation, but we also need to address demand. And that's where I think you can have a lot more innovation than what you see today. You can make building envelopes better. A lot of commercial buildings have that incentive already, but a lot of homes don't. I think it would also be interesting to look at geothermal networks to use to take cooling and heating load off of the grid, and again, reduce those peak times before the sun comes up or right after the sun goes down. I think there are a lot of policy initiatives that can look at how to take load off the grid at certain times. And then there needs to be compensation for conservation. a lot of companies, Bitcoin miners, you read the headlines of the tens of millions of dollars that those companies get paid to back off, but then when we ask customers to conserve, at their homes, there is no compensation, and that works for a brief period of time. If we do it once, you'd be amazed at how responsive folks are. You do it the next day and you've got a little bit less participation. You do it the next day, you've got a lot less participation, because people are not likely to change their behavior over long periods of time, right? And so we also need to make sure that the market is compensating customers for using less when we need them to use less to benefit us all. And so a lot of policy work to be done, again, on lots of different things, and I do think you need to address them all, not just one of them, and we need to address them now, because last summer we had 21 new peaks on the grid. And I think you will just continue to see that happening. Set aside industrial electrification, set aside transportation electrification. We're having so many new people move to this state, and they're not bringing infrastructure with them. And so if that was the only thing that would continue, you're going to continue to see new peaks every summer. 21 of them, I bet, or more this summer. Right, so we need to move with some speed to address these issues, because infrastructure doesn't get built overnight. So if we addressed all of these issues, I hope that by the end of the decade, they would be materially in place, right? And so the question is, do we have that long before it's going to be a problem?
Hi, David Bernal from Purdue University. So I'm one of those professors, sorry. The question was actually for Prasenjeet. You were talking about the electrification of chemical processes, of crackers in particular, right? Which is actually one of the topics I'm working with. And then you mentioned that there were other places where you can see electrification being one, like, an important factor in turning these systems into more renewable ones. Can you maybe clarify those, and what should we be looking at Purdue, at C-STAR, at all the universities that are working on this? Thanks.
Yeah, happy to. Look, I think electrification as a concept to decarbonize is a pretty interesting concept. And we should maximize its use wherever we can. So in the chemical process industry, wherever you have an endothermic reaction, which requires heat, as long as the temperature of that chemistry is up to a certain threshold, we find electrification works. So for example, if it's 200 degrees C or less, lots of heat pumps for heat integration. If you have a thermal chemistry that happens at 400 degrees C, maybe electrification works. We have done lots for reactors at that kind of chemistry range electrified. The point where we hit the limit is more like 650 to 700 degrees C. That's based on what we know. That doesn't mean that the world doesn't have a better solution. At least based on our internal research, we start to hit materials limit, we start to hit performance limits, and so on. Now, when I make these comments, I'm coming from the fact that just showing a feasibility is not enough. It has to scale economically at the scales we're talking about. So for instance, I could electrify an 850 degrees C cracker in a lab scale, but will that scale economically when I'm trying to make a 1 million ton a year kind of a cracker? That's where the difference in opinion is. I think the approach that the industry is taking is actually bifurcated. There is a group that is building the e-cracker technology, which a number of large companies are involved in, and they're making good technical progress. But there is an equally important group that's saying that, well, there is an other clever solution to do the same decarbonization through hydrogen, and which is the path that we have chosen for now because that scales economically. That doesn't mean that we are saying e-cracker would not work, but it's time we feel that still hasn't come yet. But it's certainly an area of research, and I think the academics should certainly focus on that, because 5 years down the line, I might change my answer, because if I see that the progress has been there, then certainly that's the direction we want to go as well.
More questions?
Question to Jason. In terms of transmission, we know there's a lot of line loss, especially in the summer. Is there any changes that you see in the future that will help with that situation?
Nothing off the top of my head to fully solve that situation, but happy to have a discussion offline after I double check with some of my colleagues. I'm the lawyer, remember, so sorry I can't be more helpful, but it was truthful. I don't know.
Last call for questions.
That's a good answer.
So, Prasenjeet, my question is for you that how do you see the viability of existing infrastructure to move SAF?
To move SAF.
So we are seeing that it's supposed to be a drop in fuel as a substitute.
Can we use the Colonial Pipeline to move SAF?
Well, I was focused only on making the SAF portion of it. So all my work has been, how do I find the catalyst that will make the SAF for you, and how do
Maybe
I
we can build an airport at Baytown.
So I don't need a law help, but I need a technical help to be able to answer that question. That can we move using Colonial Pipeline or not? My general principle would be that, look, we want to maximize the existing infrastructure as much as we can, as opposed to building a new pipeline. I mean, that should be a going-in position. So if the current pipelines can be stretched to do that, then that would be one way of, or repurposing pipelines that are already existing. But beyond that, I haven't given this much thought.
That kind of tells you that SAF production is still a while away. I'm pretty sure. That's a great question, by the way. But I'm pretty sure that once SAF production starts achieving material volumes, right? Some of these details of how do you get them to hobby or intercontinental will start.
I mean, just to build on that same point, I mean, in your charts, you said SAF is going to be like 1% right now and 5% by the end of the decade.
By end of 2050. No, okay,
2030. So we have been focusing on making that 5%. How do we make sure that we can make a cost-effective solution for the market? I think maybe I'll end with one last comment. All of the energy transition solutions at the end of the day has to be affordable, which is a point that I think doesn't get emphasized enough. There's a number of ways to do chemistry. Just because the chemistry works doesn't mean that it's going to be the solution that the world needs. Customers have to be able to afford that solution. And that's where technology plays such a big role, that we'll have to bring the cost down. Back to SAF, we spent almost a decade to make sure the SAF costs are competitive in the market, that you don't have to pay too much of a premium to get to it. But that's phase one. And phase two will be, if we now start hitting the infrastructure limits, then that will be the next wave. How do we unlock that?
Thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for being with us. I do want to say that we have a third day tomorrow. So for those of you who are joining us, we welcome you tomorrow. For those of you who have other plans, please reconsider, please rethink. You're missing an amazing opportunity to hear some really interesting speakers. If you haven't figured out, I love speakers from the forthcoming panels more than I love existing panel speakers. I'm just kidding. But thank you very much. So grateful that all of you have stayed here through the end of this panel. Thank you very much. Let's give them a big hand.